You've got a lot to unpack here. There's banking regulations, there's government oversight. Talk to us.
Well, the first of all, let's give credit to the people who really started talking about this story. Marty Bent from OnRamp Bitcoin wrote a fantastic article, and I'm happy to say I was able to be on OnRamp Bitcoin's their podcast last week. It's always great talking to those guys. And a couple of weeks ago, Marty interviewed Caitlin Long, who is the CEO of Custodia Bank. And Caitlin and Marty talked about there is now evidence that our government conspired to kill Silvergate Bank. So, if you guys remember about a year and a half ago when we were having those issues with a certain number of US banks, some large ones, some medium sized ones, Silvergate Bank was one of the ones that was closed down. And at the time, the story we were told was, well, they don't have enough reserve protection. They're losing value. Their bond portfolio is declining, and we need to wrap it up before their customers are not able to get, their deposits back. They were worried about a run on the bank. So it turns out that there's evidence that none of this is true. The White House and Senator Elizabeth Warren and other key regulators in the Federal Reserve appear to have conspired to kill Silverbank. They were told they needed to drop their digital asset customers, and that reflects a broader government strategy to stifle Bitcoin and other digital assets. And the way that we know that the government action was fraudulent and wrong is because Silvergate Bank, when they wound down, they had enough capital. They were able to return all of their depositors' money. And so what we're seeing here is something completely different, right? It clearly wasn't a safety issue, so it must have been something else.
Interesting. Why are they shutting it down?
Well, so I think there are two things happening. One, there's a natural reason why the US government would be against Bitcoin and other digital assets. Um, the advantage of having your own fiat currency, and fiat is just a fancy word for a government sponsored currency. In the case of the United States, the dollar used to be backed by gold. Now it's backed by faith and credit. So we're talking about the credit of an organization that is $36 trillion in the hole. And, if you had faith in the US government, you wouldn't be watching Deep Knowledge Investing do the five things. There's no one in our audience who has faith in the government. And faith is a wonderful thing. And we suggest that you invest that faith in your family, your friends, your spouse, your clergy person, your church, your synagogue, but not in the government. Um, and so the advantage of having a fiat currency that you control is something called seniorage. And that's just a fancy way for saying that the government is able to use their power of creating currency to take value. And so think about it this way. When the government creates currency and we have inflation, we tell people don't think about it as rising prices, think about it as a loss in the purchasing power of your dollar. So the question is, if you're losing purchasing power, where is that going? Well, the government is stealing it from you a little bit at a time. The more people who are using Bitcoin or other digital assets, the less power they have in the dollar. So Bitcoin is a threat to the dollar. The other thing that's happening, and I'm really sorry to talk about this because it's disappointing, but the government has been using a variety of ways to pressure banks to drop services to companies engaged in legal businesses where the government doesn't approve of the business. And that is absolutely unconstitutional. It is a misuse of power. Denying banking services to legal companies is a misuse of power. And that's a crucial point. And so, basically what we're seeing is the government is killing banks if they lend to people engaged with, on industries that aren't favored at the moment, and anything related to Bitcoin, they're killing these banks. And so, my question for the people watching this, is do you want the government and an unelected bureaucracy to have this much power? And before any of you answer, just remember the party that you don't like will be in power at some point in the next 4 years or 8 years or a few months or whatever it is, right? Whether you're on team red or team blue, somebody you don't like is going to be in a position to make that policy, right? I don't want the government involved in that kind of activity. And I want to applaud Caitlin Long and Marty Bent for making this clear to people. One final point I would make on this, and this is a really important one, and I think Caitlin has been on this story and right for years. The government has denied, and the Federal Reserve has denied banking charters and a Federal Reserve master account to fully reserved banks. And they claim that it's about safety, but every other bank that's approved by the Fed is fractionally reserved. And that's just, again, a fancy way of saying that the bank lends more money than it takes in, right? So if the bank has, I'm making this up, $1 million of deposits, they might make 2 or 3 or 5 or $10 million of loans and creating currency doing that. So if all of the depositors went to the bank and lined up and wanted to get their money, the bank wouldn't have the money. They might have assets that they could call on, but this is how you end up with bank runs. A fully reserved bank can't have that problem. A fully reserved bank has all of the money on hand. It is by definition safer. And the reason the government is rejecting these and pushing people away from them is because what would happen, right? Right now, if you're listening to this and you have money in the bank, your money is in a fractionally reserved bank. You've bought into the system and you think it's your money, but it is not your money. You are an unsecured creditor to the bank. It's a very unpleasant way to think about it, but the truth is when you put your money in the bank, it is no longer your money. You are a creditor to an institution that might fail. A fully reserved bank wouldn't fail. So why would the government reject that? Why would they not give them access to a Federal Reserve master account? The reason is because people would then choose, instead of to do business and deposit their money with a fractionally reserved bank, all of that money would go to the fully reserved banks. And who do you think controls the Federal Reserve? It is the very large fractionally reserved banks. This is political power masquerading as consumer safety. And it is the opposite of consumer safety. Again, Marty and Caitlin have been right on this. Howard, before you move us along, I want to go to Alex on this. I know Alex has done a ton of work, and as well as we fortunately, Alex interned for Alex. Why don't you tell people who you interned for before? Because this is somebody who, his work in this area has been phenomenal, and I've read a lot of it as well.
Yeah, so when I started studying economics at university about a year or so ago, I started learning about fiat currencies, and I came across the author and kind of famous on FinTwit, as he'd like me to say, Peruvian Bull. And I read his book and I reached out to him, and we've been doing work together ever since, which has been amazing. And I've definitely learned a lot about fiat currencies, Bitcoin, and kind of how fractional reserve banking works. So I guess that's kind of my background and how this applies to this. I mean, I would kind of just echo your points, and I would kind of just hone in on 2 specific ones. I think the first one being kind of this double standard that's been set up, whereby kind of Caitlin Long has been kind of brushed aside, but recently we've seen, I think it was Bank of New York Mellon, that is now allowed to custody Bitcoin and other digital assets. Whereas she's almost, as I said, been brushed aside, and that may, as I say, seem like a double standard, unfair, but it's also kind of risky in what you were talking about with kind of fractional reserve banking. Now, fractional reserve banking is, well, it only really works under a fiat standard, obviously, because it would just be too risky to do it in a sound money standard. And when there is a bank run on the bank, the printer or the central bank can come in and bail out the banks. We saw that kind of thing happen in 2008. Now, how this kind of applies to this situation is Caitlin Long's bank actually had one-to-one custody, which, as you mentioned, when there was this kind of run, it was fine. Everything was fine because it was one-to-one. When you withdraw it's just a perfect ledger, -1 +1. With fractional reserve, especially with digital assets, almost specifically Bitcoin, which has the characteristic of, well, whether you want to characterize Bitcoin as a currency or an asset, it is deflationary. So if you were to fractionally reserve Bitcoin, if the government allowed BNY to fractionally reserve Bitcoin, it's not only unfair, it's also very, very risky, because when they lend out 10-to-1, 100-to-1, or whatever it may be, if someone were to call, or there was a call on that Bitcoin, or if there was a problem, there's no one there to bail them out because of its deflationary nature. And so this can create massive problems. I mean, I believe this is kind of what we saw with FTX. And so that's why, although keeping your Bitcoin in one-to-one custody with kind of Caitlin Long or whomever, the brilliance of Bitcoin is that you can keep it in self-custody, where you don't have to trust anyone by yourself, and no one can loan it out against you. So yeah, just to wrap up, I think not only is this unjust, but it's quite risky as well to be doing things like this.
All right. All great points, Alex. I'm going to leave everyone with 3 key things that you can do or should do. For people listening to this, we suggest that you follow Peruvian Bull on X, formerly Twitter. He's worth
And on
reading.
YouTube, and on YouTube now.
And on YouTube, yes. If you are at the Federal Reserve and you are watching this, we suggest that you approve a Federal Reserve master account for Custodia Bank and apologize to Caitlin Long. And for people listening to this, yes, we still like Bitcoin a lot. And if you own Bitcoin, please do not leave it on the exchanges. We recommend self-custody. If you're having trouble with that, send us a note, put a note in the comments. Deep Knowledge Investing has published a self-custody guide that you can use. We get that it can be frightening to self-custody. And if you've never done it before, it can be intimidating. I assure you, we have made it very, very simple. And if you're willing to devote an hour to doing a little reading and following some instructions, it will work. You'll be able to do it. So we encourage everybody to self-custody. If they're your keys, they're your coins.